Good day, Math 30-2s. Welcome to a conversation about the diploma for June of 2022. Now, we haven't seen a diploma exam written since January of 2020, so it has been some time. And so it is important as we look at understanding the diploma exam and what to expect that we consider some general information about format, length, and really being prepared in advance for what to expect. The second part of our video today is going to talk about the written response and hopefully try to meet some of those subtle expectations so that we understand what it means to write a written response question and have someone grade it properly. The first thing we can talk about is the worth of the exam. For 21-22, this school year, there has been a temporary shift from the 70-30 historical weighting to a 90-10 weighting. So your diploma exam will be worth 10% this June. I'd like you to consider that impact just looking in the bottom left corner. Imagine for a second your school awarded mark was 80% and your diploma mark was 70%. At a weighting of 70% historically, your school awarded worth would be 56%. So 56% of your overall mark is coming from your school mark. At a 30% weighting on a mark of 70%, your overall contribution from the diploma would be 21%. Overall mark would therefore be 77% if you add those two numbers up. But in the bottom right corner, imagine a school awarded mark of 80% again at a worth of 90%, as you're going to see in June. That contributes to a 72% mark out of the 79 overall that you would be getting in the end with a similar sort of mark on each. So you can see the impact of that diploma exam from a 70 to a 90, how much mark or how much worth is coming from that school awarded part, 56 or 72. So there's a very big difference of how that weighting is going to impact your overall mark. Regarding time, now the diploma exam is designed to be completed in under 3 hours, but you do have up to 6 hours should you need it. You do, though, have to stay a minimum of 1 hour in the exam, so you're not actually allowed to finish the exam in 45 minutes, guessing your way through it and then just walking out. You do have to stay a minimum of 1 hour. For a student that for some reason shows up 5 minutes late, you still can be entered into the exam, and you're going to have some information to fill out, but you can still write the exam, and the exam is still considered secure because no one has, walked in, looked at things, and then immediately left. So there is a window of time where you can arrive slightly late and still be entered into a secure exam because of that minimum writing time. Now the question format for Math 30-2. There is a machine scored section where you're filling in bubbles, and there's a written response section that follows in the exam. Those multiple choice and numerical response questions will be mixed together, and they will be following the same order as you kind of follow throughout the exam. So you'll start the exam by seeing a bunch of puzzles and games and logical reasoning and set theory, and then into some perms, comms, and probability, and you'll end with all the relations and functions towards the end. Basically, your topics will be clustered together. Following that, you're going to have the written response section, and there's going to be some of those questions that follow. Now, there are 24 multiple choice and 8 numerical response, and they are going to be mixed together. So you might see multiple choice 1, multiple choice 2, numerical response 1, multiple choice 3, multiple choice 4, numerical response 2. They can be all mixed together. But then the written response does follow after. And there is a weighting of the machine scored in the written response. So all those bubbles that you fill in are worth 3/4 of your exam. Now you might be thinking, am I reading that correctly? Are there 2 written response questions worth 25% of the exam? Yes. However, the written response 2 questions has some parts within each. The first question is going to have a 1 mark part and then a 2 mark, 2 mark, 2 mark. So technically there are 4 questions in the first question. And the reason why they're worded this way is to say that first question is of a certain context. So there might be a question about populations of a town in the first question. And those 4 parts are going to be all related in some way, but they might involve set theory and permutations and combinations and exponents and logs, and they might all have different units, but it's all in a certain context relating together. So there's going to be 7 marks for the first question, 7 marks for the second question, for a total of 14 marks. And if you combine those 14 marks in the written with the 24 multiple choice and 8 numerical response, you've got 46 marks on your diploma exam. Now, if you're thinking about there's 24 multiple choice questions and 8 numerical response, you might consider, well, how much is each question going to be worth? How much is each multiple choice question worth? 2%, 3%, 4%, 1%? That might be a good activity to pause the video and test that out. How much is each question actually worth? Topic breakdown. Now, I did say that you are going to have some questions that are going to be sort of in order. Now, the only breakdown that we really do get for Math 30-2 is that there's 3 topics. The first topic is logical reasoning, and this includes the puzzles and games. How do you strategize through a Sudoku? How do you work your way through a code breaker puzzle? So puzzles and games, you've got set theory that's a part of that, and that's going to be worth about 15 to 20% of your exam. So with 46 marks, you're looking at 7 to 9 questions or marks coming from that logical reasoning section. Following that, you're looking at some probability, which does include the permutations and combinations, and that'll be worth about a third of the exam, 30 to 35%. So you're anticipating about 14 to 16 marks there. And lastly, relations and functions, which isn't so great that we've got this cluster of polynomials and exponents and logs and rationals and sinusoidal functions. It's really just a collection of all these regressions things that are sort of sitting there. And it's worth about half of the exam, so 21 to 26 marks coming from that cluster of relations and functions. There's no better breakdown than we get than that. So how do we anticipate what to expect when we open up those questions and look at the first multiple choice or numerical? Well, let's try to talk about the styles and consider what questions we're used to with what we might be anticipating. Often questions have an information box, not always, but often there's an information box which gives some information, and then you're asked to use that and then read the question that actually follows. So you'll notice in this question, Antoine incorrectly solved an equation, and some work is shown below with some steps, and then the question actually follows the box, and it says Antoine's first recorded error is shown in. And so not really a question, it's more of a statement that you need to complete. The first error was shown in what step? And first is bolded. So sometimes you're going to see specific things bolded to really draw your attention. So what we're noticing with these multiple choice styles is that there may, not always, but may be an information box with some information that follows. Numerical response can look very, very similar with an information box. Again, not always. But in this one, it's showing, interestingly, with this rational expression operation question, a number of statements. And it's asking about non-permissible values. The question or statement that follows at the end asks to indicate the 3 statements that represent the non-permissible values. So for this question, you're again not saying the non-permissible values are, you're saying the statements that refer or represent the non-permissible values are. So often in these numerical response questions, you're seeing reference numbers or codes or statements that help support the answering of the question. So not always are you actually writing down the answer to the question. You're using the answer to this question to record the statements. And this often occurs. One of the things that you'll notice at the very, very bottom, it says record all 3 digits of your answer in any order. In any order. So if the answer was 1, 2, 3 for the statements, you could record 2, 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, and so on. And all 3 would be recorded correctly or scored correctly when you answer your fill in your bubbles. So the numerical response boxes, if there is more than one answer to a question, they will all be validated and correctly shown. And so sometimes there is more than one answer to a numerical response question. On the day of the exam, what should you be doing to be prepared? This is a great opportunity in your class to pause the video, just press that space bar, and have a conversation about these 3 questions. There may be far more subtle things about exam setup and about the location of the exam and what to do to be prepared. Some of the key things just on that writing your exam side, what should you be bringing to the exam? Make sure you bring more than one pencil. What happens if you bring a pencil and it's not sharpened or you're writing and the pencil lead breaks and you're sitting there and you're like, great, I don't have a way to record my answers. So bring more than one pencil, make sure they're sharpened in advance. Bring an eraser that really does erase well because you need to erase clearly on those bubble sheets so that it's not scoring your marks incorrectly if you do make any changes. Bring in a set of batteries or a fresh pair of batteries for your calculator. Bring in a calculator. You're allowed to bring one graphing calculator in. So don't show up on the morning of your exam and say, Mr., Mrs., Ms., teacher, I don't have a calculator. Can I borrow one? Make sure you have that in advance and lined up. But basically bring everything that you need so that you're not thinking about something bad happening during the exam where you're now not able to write. What should you not bring to an exam? Don't bring any electronic devices, no cell phones, smart watches, glasses with video camera in it, and no earbuds, nothing electronic that would invalidate the exam. It has happened before where students have come in with a cell phone and their scores have been canceled and they don't get a mark for that diploma. So don't bring any electronic devices. Make sure you're comfortable coming into the exam. So wear clothing that you're not hot, you're not cold, you're comfortable. Don't bring in a winter jacket, especially if it's June. It's also fairly bulky and you'll probably not allow it in. Don't bring in your backpacks and all these extra things to your desk. Just bring in what you need, but don't bring anything that would invalidate your exam. Many schools have policies about no hats and things like that as well, but you can have that conversation at your school. What should I be doing on the morning of the exam? Again, some important things are getting a good night's sleep. Whether you feel prepared or not for the actual content of the exam, getting a good night's sleep if you can allows your brain to be on the ball, to be thinking well, and not to be groggy if you crammed till 3, 4 in the morning and then you wake up and your brain is foggy. Don't go in with a foggy brain. Go in well rested. It's better to be well rested than to go in foggy. Make sure you go to the washroom before the exam. Make sure you have something to eat before the exam. If you're staying for 4 hours and your brain is thinking, I'm so hungry or I have to go to the washroom, those are some things that could definitely take your mind off of mathematics. Anything that takes your brain away from the math and from the exam is a distraction. So the written response, what does the written response look like? Well, similarly, you are going to often see these context or information boxes again. And I'm going to talk you through a single question with the 4 parts. So what we've got here is a context box talking about a cup of coffee, some time, and the amount of coffee that's in a person's body based on drinking a cup of coffee and the time of the day. Now, it does in this question after this table is shown, ask for some exponential function in a certain form. What I noticed for this first part, 2a at the very bottom, it's asking about an exponential function that models the amount of caffeine. And it says round a to the nearest whole number and b to the nearest hundredth. With a question like this, I'm thinking, well, you're doing some regression. This is probably worth 1 mark. Type it in, L1, L2, do your regression, get your equation, and there's your 1 mark for part A of question 2. But again, very similar feel to the multiple choice and numerical with this context. As we look at showing our work, communicating, understanding, it's important as we consider these next parts and what's bolded for these. It's not really talking about the first recorded error or where to round things or very superficial things. What's being bolded in these questions are the words compare, algebraically determine, and determine. These are verbs. These are in math, we call them directing words, and they tell you what it takes to meet expectation. this first question in this context box for part B here, it's saying something about Stan had 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. What's the new equation? So you have this previous regression equation, you have this new regression equation, and it's asking you to compare the equation of the new function to the original function. And so what does compare mean? Does compare mean it's like, oh, this number is bigger? Well, compare has a very specific definition in math for especially Alberta education. Compare means talk about similarities and differences, not just one of those. So you need to say, well, this is the same, but this is different. And you need to address both parts to fully meet the expectation of that word compare. So it is important to actually study in advance what the directing words mean, which is sort of counterintuitive for a math exam. You're studying the verbs. The third part of this question, part C here in the middle, says something about caffeine having a half-life and some more information. And then it says the amount of caffeine can be modeled using an exponential function blank. So 250, a starting amount, half of it disappears every 6 hours. And so there's a t over 6 in that exponent position. And then it later says algebraically determine something about 50 milligrams when the body gets to 50 milligrams. So we have actually an equation set up where it's 50 is equal to, and this 250 part. Algebraically determine. Algebraically means this is not a calculator question. Determine means show your work. Get the answer, but communicate all the ways that you're getting your answer. So when you see the word determine, don't write a final answer and say, that's it. You do have to show your work when it says determine, and that is a specific definition for Alberta education. So algebraically determine, for this one, you're actually doing maybe some logs. Maybe you're doing, we are getting the exponents to the same base if possible, but somehow with this question, you do need to show your work and you do have to do this without a calculator. In the last question, it says something about in a poll of 82 people in the office, it talks about people with coffee and people who drink tea and people that didn't do either. This is a set theory question, still talking about coffee. So we're seeing determine the number of people, show your work, who consume both coffee and tea. So what we saw was a regression equation for exponentials. We saw comparing a question. We saw a logarithms, potentially, a logarithms question. And now we're seeing a set theory question all about caffeine and coffee and tea. So we're seeing, again, one context with 4 parts. 1 mark, 2, 2, 2 marks. But again, all of these directing words are something that I'm focusing on. Let's do one more of these. And as we look at some of the instructions that you're going to see in the exam, it is important to write your responses in the examination book as neatly as possible. So there is a person that is actually marking this exam. A group of teachers get selected, it could be your math teacher, and they essentially come to one big room and they get handed a stack of exams, and a lead teacher, a lead manager says, this is what is worth marks for this question. And so there's a big discussion that follows, and a scoring guide helps to determine what is worth marks. But a person is marking these, a human being, and so it's important to write as neatly as possible so your work is recognized and understood. You do need to address all aspects of the question, so don't ignore things. Show your work, show calculations, show what formulas are being used, include units, write a concluding statement at the end to say this is the answer to the question. Communicate as much as possible. And this doesn't mean you have to write a big paragraph with a thesis and a nice introduction. This can be point form. You can draw pictures. You can use thought bubbles and say things like, when I did this, this is what I mean. Communicate in any way that's meaningful to you, that shows your understanding. Don't assume that the person marking understands what you're not writing. So don't assume that they know what you know. Write it down. So there are going to be some subtleties in the written response. When you're looking at some units like probability and you're talking about odds in favor or odds against, you really need to be explicit in how you state everything on this written response test. One of the examples, odds in favor of A. If you're saying there's a bunch of blue marbles being selected and a bunch of red marbles being selected, and the question is asking about what are the odds in favor of selecting a blue marble, and you're using your words and you're saying, the odds are 4-3. So you can't only say the odds are, you would need to be very explicit and say the odds in favor of blue. Because that could be misinterpreted in the odds against taking a blue or selecting blue. You just have to be really explicit with everything that you say. There's some subtle things like probability, especially for the numerical response. Probability is a value between 0 and 1. Probability shouldn't be written as a percentage. So if the probability of rain is 0.43, the person marking wants you to know probability is 0.43. You can say also as a percentage it's 43%, but the probability should be 0.43, and that shows a level of understanding if you can articulate some of those subtle things very carefully. The solution is extraneous because you can't have a negative number of people. If you're solving a rational equation and you get a negative number that's not going to work for that context, you do need to clearly communicate if you're doing things like crossing off a negative answer and saying, oh, it doesn't work because it's negative. If you just cross it off and say, well, the answer is 6. Why are you crossing off an answer? Is it just random? You need to state, I'm crossing this off because you can't have a negative number of people. If you're doing something that just seems random, explain why you're doing it. So be very clear with everything that you do and be clear in the language that you're using and to ensure that it's very mathematical and precise. Okay, directing words practice. This is going to be a great opportunity for you to pause the video and have lots more conversations than what we're going to talk about together here. So the directing words, there's a full list of directing words. Some of the more common ones to expect are kind of shown here. And I put these into a contextual question. So you might see things like algebraically solve the following exponential equation. What does it mean to algebraically solve? Compare the effects of each parameter in the two equations. Compare, again, is that show how they're similar and show how they're different. Talk about both parts of that, not just how they're the same or how they're different only. Describe the characteristics of the polynomial functions. What does it mean to describe? Again, great opportunity to pause the videos and have this conversation. Look up the definitions, talk about them. Determine the solution to the quadratic equation. Important here, determine doesn't mean only get your answer. Determine means show your work. Show all relevant and pertinent calculations and so on. Explain why the sinusoidal expression has two restrictions. Explain. What does explain mean? Sketch the graph of the polynomial function. Sketch. Okay, so drawing, showing pictures, graphs, sketching. Again, there is a full document of directing words. Talk about the common ones to expect. Talk about which ones might be somewhat straightforward and which ones might be a little bit more subtle in their expectation. Again, pausing the video is a great opportunity right now, but as you're practicing the directing words, here's an example of previously released items where it talks about populations of two towns, about two provinces where there's an initial population and how things are changing with time. So here's the context bubble. I'd like you to consider 5 different questions with the same context bubble. How would you approach each question, and what does it mean to actually meet the expectation of this question? So whether you actually determine the answer to each question, 1 through 5 here, maybe more importantly is to say, well, what does it take to meet the expectation of this question? So for the first one, describe the significance of each numerical value in each equation listed above. What do you have to do? What does an answer look like that is complete? Versus number 2, using the numerical values in the functions above, compare the information that these values provide about the number of farming families. Are those the same thing or are they different? And for determine, verify, and explain, give each of these a little bit of thought and consider what it takes to meet the expectation of each question. Similar opportunity, pause the video, single context with 4 different possible questions. A student sketches a third degree polynomial p of x with a minimum of 2 zeros. I'm seeing a sketch, verify, explain, and a justify. Again, pause the video, have a conversation about what it means to meet the expectation of each. There's going to be a lot more practice that you can find if you search Math 30-2 Diploma Written Response. You'll find a guide to the written response, but really what you're going to see in there is an opportunity to see some sample student work and more questions. And in an example like this one, you're seeing some rational expressions and there's a product. And what you're going to notice about this student's work at the very, very end, what you might notice is that there's an 84 over a 4 that's not completely canceled. And so what it looks like for the person who's marking these questions is they're actually given a scoring guide. And this scoring guide is very, very explicit and very, very clean in saying what is worth marks. This scoring guide is a part of that document that is provided if you were to search online for this information. In this question, italicized in this red box here, it says, for example, the student could correctly determine the product but not reduce the coefficients. For this question, there isn't a person marking that's sort of making up what is worth marks individually. There is a very clear process of what it takes to earn marks for the Math 30-2 exam. And in this question, very clearly those coefficients aren't canceled. So the person marking would say, oh, this is very clearly worth 1.5 out of 2. There's lots more opportunities to again, look through those examples and see sample student work and what it takes to get marks. But how do you start getting prepared? Let's move past that a little bit and talk about preparation. One of the best things that you can do in advance, well in advance, is make a study guide. I would revisit your units that you've done from February on and consider what is important in each unit. What are some very, very maybe relevant and common examples that you could say are very important? And what are some language, what are some words that probably stand out as being important? And maybe what are some common mistakes that you often made that you really need to remember, like don't do this, Where do non-permissible values come from in rational expression division? In that one extra place in the top right, make those comments about common mistakes and important questions. If you feel like you're pushing really hard with your studying, you could go in and look at Math 30-2 standards and exemplars. Again, search that, and it lists what are the things you need to know for Math 30-2 and what are some important standards or expectations of questions. You could go to Quest A+, and just search it, and with Quest A+, you're going to see 2013 released items and some 2019 released items. And again, you can click on this link or search written response information to see some of those examples and sample student work and more scoring guides if you're really looking for more to consider. So it's kind of reviewing and studying prior to practicing and looking at and investigating some of those Alberta education examples and documents. At the very, very end, when you get your results, they will be accessible on MyPass. Again, search it, Alberta MyPass, and you should all have an account because it's what gives you your marks, gives you information on your credits and what you kind of need to graduate. Expect those marks to be done within about 3 to 4 weeks. Usually about 3 weeks, marks start coming in. And then once those marks come in, you have some opportunities to kind of reconsider things if the marks are not as you like. You can retake Math 30-2. It is grade 12 and it is June, but you can retake Math 30-2 without writing a new diploma. If your diploma mark was fantastic, but your school awarded mark worth 90% is not as great, you can retake the course. And whichever course mark is higher, you get to keep that as your your final mark. You can alternatively rewrite a diploma exam without taking Math 30-2. There is an August writing of a diploma exam, and if you felt like you needed to rewrite a diploma exam, you can rewrite that and not have to take Math 30-2 as a course. The higher of those two is taken and given. So you can have a rewrite of a diploma exam. The highest mark for a rewrite is awarded. You can, though, also have your diploma exam for ELA, social, the sciences, for math. You can have a diploma exam rescored as well. Often you'll see a rescore happen in the written response for ELA because that is, there are multiple people that do grade your written component, your Part A, for an ELA exam. But you might consider for math or the sciences or social, a rescore as well. If you consider the machine scored section to not reflect what you feel you did. Like if you thought, I got 80, 90% and your mark came back wildly at 20%, you might say, well, something is wrong. And if you actually entered the bubbles in incorrectly, maybe that is worth someone looking at your machine scored section more closely. And if there is a change in your marks, what might happen is, and this could be a written response as well, your rescored mark, whether higher or lower, is your final mark. So if you had a ELA or your math written response rescored and your mark was lower on a rescore, that becomes your final mark. But even for a machine scored section, it's super rare. But if something doesn't feel right, you can have an exam more closely examined for a rescore for both written response or machine scored sections. Hopefully things do not result in that, but with a written response and a full machine scored section, there's lots of things to consider for the Math 30-2 exam. And with that, I wish you luck.